There was a time when rain was not an interruption, but a condition of life, not a passing storm, but a presence that settled into the ground, into the air, and slowly into the body itself. Days did not begin with dryness, and nights did not restore it. The earth remained soft under every step. Surfaces never fully dried. Even stillness carried a quiet dampness that could not be shaken off. In such a world, difficulty did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Warmth became harder to hold. Materials wore down without being used. Food did not simply run out. It changed, slowly, in ways that made it less safe to eat. Fire, when it could be made, did not always stay. Over time, survival was shaped less by dramatic events, and more by the steady pressure of an environment that never gave the body a chance to fully recover. Early humans did not live in a single, stable climate. Across long stretches of time, many groups moved through landscapes where rainfall was frequent, sometimes persistent. The evidence is quiet but consistent. Soils that formed under repeated wetness, plant remains that suggest dense, moisture-rich environments, and temporary shelters placed where the ground might drain just slightly better than the surroundings. These are small details, but together they point to a simple reality. Water was not always a resource to collect, but a condition to endure. There are no direct accounts of how it felt to live like this. No voice describes the sensation of never being fully dry, but the human body today still responds to prolonged dampness in predictable ways. It loses heat more easily. Skin becomes more vulnerable. Rest becomes less effective. These are not dramatic failures. They are gradual shifts, repeated over days, then weeks, then across entire seasons. If comfort depends on the ability to escape the environment, then a place of endless rain removes that possibility. There is no clear boundary between outside and inside, no true separation between the body and the world around it, only a continuous adjustment, moment by moment, to conditions that do not pause. So the question is not how people avoided the rain, it is how they continued, day after day, when avoiding it was never an option. What human life was really like living in endless rain. The ground does not announce its instability. It appears solid at a glance, carrying the same muted colours, the same familiar textures. But under constant rain, what seems firm begins to shift in small, quiet ways. Soil loosens, layers soften. What once held weight now yields just slightly, then more with each passing step. For early humans moving through such environments, there would have been no clear moment when the land changed. Only a gradual realization that each step required more attention, more balance, more energy than before. In regions shaped by persistent rainfall, the surface of the earth rarely returns to a fully dry state. Water does not simply fall and disappear. It lingers. It seeps into the upper layers of soil, filling the small spaces between particles, reducing friction, weakening structure. Over time, the ground becomes something in between solid and fluid. Not enough to collapse entirely, but enough to resist the kind of movement the human body depends on. Walking, which in dry conditions is almost automatic, becomes a process of constant adjustment. The human foot is adapted for varied terrain, but it relies on feedback from stable contact. When that contact is uncertain, the body compensates. Muscles remain slightly tense. Steps become shorter, more deliberate. Energy expenditure increases, even if distance remains the same. This is not a dramatic change, but a continuous one. Across hours, across days, it accumulates. The difference is not in a single step, but in the total cost of movement over time. Long before constructed paths or hardened surfaces, early humans would have navigated landscapes where the ground itself was part of the challenge. Archaeological evidence from regions known for high rainfall suggests patterns of movement that favour slightly elevated terrain, areas where drainage is marginally better. These are not dry places, but they are less saturated. Even a small difference in elevation can affect how water collects and how quickly it leaves. Such choices, repeated over generations, reflect an awareness not of dryness as a comfort, but of relative stability as a necessity. The presence of water in the soil also changes what grows upon it. Plant life adapts to these conditions, often becoming denser, more intertwined, with roots that spread across the surface rather than deep below. For humans, this creates another layer of complexity. Movement is not only over soft ground, but through vegetation that resists passage. Each step must negotiate both the instability below and the resistance above. The environment does not block movement completely, but it slows it, reshapes it, and demands more from the body. From the perspective of human origins, this kind of environment is not unusual. Early members of the genus Homo evolved in Africa, where climate patterns shifted over long periods. Wet phases expanded certain landscapes, creating conditions where water was more consistently present. While not all regions experienced continuous rain, many would have gone through extended periods where drying was incomplete, where the ground remained damp longer than expected. These were not brief interruptions, but recurring states of the environment. There is no direct record of how individuals experienced this, no description of the sensation of walking across ground that never fully supports you, but the physical traces remain. Campsites that appear temporary, tools found in layers of sediment shaped by water, patterns of habitation that suggest movement rather than permanence. These are indirect signs, but they point toward a way of living that adjusted to the condition of the ground itself. If stability is something we now take for granted, it is partly because we have learned to reshape the surface we move upon. We build, we level, we drain. But before these interventions, the ground was not a fixed platform. It responded to weather, to water, to time. And in a world where rain does not stop long enough for the earth to recover, stability becomes something that must be found, step by step, rather than assumed. The ground does not announce its instability. It appears solid at a glance, carrying the same muted colours, the same familiar textures. But under constant rain, what seems firm begins to shift in small, quiet ways. Soil loosens. Layers soften. What once held weight now yields just slightly, then more with each passing step. For early humans moving through such environments, there would have been no clear moment when the land changed, only a gradual awareness that each step required more attention, more balance, more energy than before. In regions shaped by persistent rainfall, the surface of the earth rarely returns to a fully dry state. Water does not simply fall and disappear. It lingers, seeping into the upper layers of soil, filling the spaces between particles, reducing friction, weakening structure. Over time, the ground becomes something between solid and fluid, not enough to collapse entirely, but enough to resist the kind of movement the human body depends on. Walking, which in dry conditions is almost automatic, becomes a process of constant adjustment. The human foot is adapted for varied terrain, but it relies on feedback from stable contact, and when that contact is uncertain, the body compensates. Muscles remain slightly tense, steps become shorter and more deliberate, and energy expenditure increases even if distance remains the same. This change is not dramatic, but continuous, and across hours, across days, it accumulates into a steady cost that shapes how far a person can go and how often they must rest. Long before constructed paths or hardened surfaces, early humans would have navigated landscapes where the ground itself was part of the challenge, and archaeological patterns in regions with sustained rainfall suggest movement that favours slightly elevated terrain where drainage is marginally better. These are not dry places, but they are less saturated, and even a small difference in elevation can affect how water collects and how quickly it leaves. Such choices, repeated over long periods, reflect an awareness not of dryness as comfort, but of relative stability as necessity. The presence of water in the soil also changes what grows upon it, and plant life in such conditions often becomes denser and more intertwined, with roots spreading across the surface rather than deep below. For humans, this creates another layer of resistance, as movement is not only over soft ground, but through vegetation that slows progress and redirects movement. Each step must negotiate both instability below and resistance above, and the environment does not block movement completely, but it reshapes it, demanding more time and more energy. From the perspective of human origins, this kind of environment is not unusual. Early members of the genus Homo evolved in regions where climate patterns shifted over long periods, and wet phases expanded landscapes where water remained present for extended durations. While not every place experienced continuous rainfall, many environments would have stayed damp longer than expected, creating conditions where dryness was temporary rather than reliable. There is no direct record describing how it felt to move across such ground, but the traces remain in subtle forms, in temporary campsites, in tools found within water-shaped sediment layers, and in patterns of repeated movement rather than permanent settlement. These traces do not speak loudly, but they point toward a way of living that adjusted constantly to the condition of the ground itself. If stability is something now taken for granted, it is because modern environments have been altered to maintain it. But in earlier periods, the ground was not a fixed platform. It responded to water, to time, and to pressure. And in a world where rain did not stop long enough for the earth to recover, stability became something that had to be found again with every step. Never fully secured, never fully lost, but always uncertain. What begins as a change beneath the feet slowly extends into the rest of the body, because unstable ground does not only affect movement, it reshapes posture, balance, and the way energy is distributed through the muscles over time. When each step cannot rely on a firm surface, the body adjusts by remaining slightly prepared for correction, with small muscles in the feet, ankles, and legs working more continuously than they would on dry, stable terrain. This does not create immediate exhaustion, but it prevents true rest even while standing or moving slowly. Over hours, this low-level effort accumulates, and the difference becomes noticeable not in a single moment, but in the gradual shortening of distance traveled, in the earlier need to stop, and in the reduced margin for carrying additional weight such as gathered food or tools. In environments where rain persists, this condition is not temporary. The ground does not return to a reliable state between movements, and so the body does not fully reset either. Each day begins from a position that is already slightly fatigued, not from dramatic exertion, but from continuous adjustment that never fully stops. From a biological perspective, the human body is capable of adapting to repeated patterns of movement, but it does so within limits that depend on recovery. Muscles require periods where they are not under constant demand, and joints rely on predictable forces to maintain efficiency. When the terrain remains unstable, these patterns are disrupted. The forces acting on the body become less predictable, and the efficiency of movement decreases. This means that more energy must be used to achieve the same result, and over time, this changes how movement is planned. Instead of covering larger distances in a single effort, movement may become more cautious, more segmented, shaped by the need to preserve energy in conditions where the ground itself adds resistance. Archaeological interpretations of mobility patterns in wetter regions often suggest shorter, repeated movements rather than long, uninterrupted travel. This is not a direct record of intention, but a reflection of what the environment allows. When the ground absorbs effort, when each step returns less stability, the body adapts by reducing unnecessary motion. Even slight inclines, small rises in terrain, or areas with firmer subsoil become meaningful, not because they offer comfort, but because they reduce the constant demand for correction. These small differences in terrain begin to guide movement decisions in ways that are subtle but consistent over long periods. From the perspective of human origins, this continuous adjustment aligns with the broader pattern of adaptation to variable environments. Early humans did not evolve in a single stable landscape, but across shifting conditions where wet and dry phases alternated. In extended wet periods, the body's ability to manage energy efficiently would have been closely tied to how well it could handle unstable ground. This is not a specialized adaptation, but a general capacity to endure variation, to maintain function, even when conditions are less than ideal. There is no evidence that early humans developed specific physical traits solely for walking on saturated ground, but the flexibility of the human gait, the ability to adjust stride length, foot placement, and balance suggests a system designed for variability rather than precision. The cost of this flexibility is that efficiency decreases when conditions are consistently poor. In a world of endless rain, this cost is not occasional, it is constant. The body does not fail under this pressure, but it operates at a slightly reduced level, conserving energy where possible, avoiding unnecessary strain, and relying on repetition rather than intensity. Over time, this creates a rhythm of movement that is slower, more deliberate, and more closely tied to the immediate condition of the ground than to any fixed plan of travel. The environment does not stop movement, but it shapes its pace, its direction, and its limits in ways that remain largely invisible unless they are considered across long periods. What appears to be simple walking becomes a continuous negotiation between the body and a surface that never fully holds still. When movement slows and the body begins to conserve energy, the question of where to stop becomes as important as how to move, because in a landscape shaped by continuous rain, there is rarely a place that can be called truly dry, only places that are slightly less affected than others. Early humans moving through such environments would not have been choosing between wet and dry ground, but between degrees of instability, searching for small advantages that could reduce exposure even if they could not eliminate it. Slight rises in terrain, areas where water drains more easily, or locations sheltered by natural formations such as rock overhangs or dense vegetation would have offered marginal improvements. These differences may appear minor, but when the ground is consistently saturated, even a small reduction in moisture can influence how the body rests, how heat is retained, and how materials are kept from further degradation. Archaeological evidence does not preserve the sensation of choosing a resting place, but it does reveal patterns that suggest repeated use of particular types of locations. Sites found on elevated ground or near natural drainage channels appear more frequently in regions known for sustained rainfall, indicating that early humans were not selecting places randomly. Instead, they were responding to the physical properties of the landscape, favoring areas where water did not accumulate as heavily. These choices were not about comfort in a modern sense, but about managing the continuous effects of moisture on the body and on the limited materials available for shelter. From a biological perspective, the need for rest is tied closely to the body's ability to recover from exertion, and in an environment where the ground itself remains damp, recovery becomes less effective. Lying down on a surface that does not insulate or that draws heat away from the body changes the quality of rest. The body may remain in a state of low-level adjustment even while still, maintaining tension to avoid direct contact with colder, wetter surfaces. Over time, this reduces the restorative value of rest, making it more difficult to regain the energy lost during movement. This is not a sudden failure, but a gradual reduction in efficiency, where each period of rest provides slightly less recovery than expected. In the context of human origins, this challenge would have been part of a broader pattern of adaptation to environments where resources and conditions were not stable. Early humans did not rely on fixed shelters or constructed environments in the way later societies would. Instead, they depended on their ability to recognize and use existing features of the landscape. In wetter periods, this would have meant identifying locations that offered even minimal protection from continuous moisture, understanding how water moved across the terrain, and adjusting patterns of movement to remain within areas that allowed for more effective rest. These adjustments would not have required explicit planning in the way it is understood today, but would have emerged through repeated experience, through the accumulation of small decisions that led to slightly better outcomes over time. The absence of permanent structures also meant that each stopping point was temporary, and the effort invested in selecting a location had to balance the time spent searching with the need to conserve energy. Staying too long in one place risked continued exposure to moisture that could not be escaped, while moving too frequently increased the cost of travel across unstable ground. This balance between movement and rest would have been shaped directly by the condition of the environment, creating a pattern of life that was neither fully mobile nor fully settled, but constantly adjusting between the two. The traces of this pattern remain in the archaeological record as scattered, repeated occupations rather than permanent settlements, suggesting a way of living that followed the shifting conditions of the land rather than imposing structure upon it. In a world of endless rain, the act of stopping was never a complete pause, but a temporary alignment with a landscape that offered only partial relief, where rest existed not as a state of comfort, but as a brief reduction in difficulty before movement began again. The body does not register moisture as a single sensation, but as a series of small changes that accumulate over time, and in a world of continuous rain, these changes do not fully reverse between one moment and the next. Skin remains slightly damp, clothing or coverings, if present, do not fully dry, and the air itself holds enough moisture to slow evaporation. This creates a condition where the body's usual methods of maintaining balance begin to shift, not dramatically, but persistently. One of the most immediate effects is on temperature. The human body relies on a narrow range of internal stability, and while it can adapt to cold or heat, the presence of constant moisture alters how heat is retained or lost. Water conducts heat away from the body more effectively than dry air, and when surfaces remain damp, this process continues even without strong wind or low temperatures. The result is not necessarily sudden cold, but a gradual reduction in retained warmth, where the body must expend more energy to maintain its internal balance. This increased demand is subtle at first, but over extended periods it becomes significant, especially when combined with the additional effort required for movement on unstable ground. In environments where rain persists, the body is rarely given the opportunity to fully recover its thermal balance. Even during periods of rest, the ground may draw heat away, and the surrounding air does not allow for efficient drying. This means that the body remains in a state of ongoing adjustment, constantly working to maintain conditions that, in drier environments, would stabilize more easily. From a biological perspective, this does not represent a failure of the body's systems, but rather a shift in how those systems are used. Energy that might otherwise support growth, repair, or extended activity is instead directed toward maintaining basic stability. Over time, this changes the overall pattern of activity, influencing how long individuals can remain active, how far they can travel, and how effectively they can recover between efforts. Evidence from studies of human physiology in modern contexts shows that prolonged exposure to damp conditions can affect not only temperature regulation, but also skin integrity and comfort, although direct comparisons to early human environments must be made carefully. The archaeological record does not preserve the condition of skin or the sensation of dampness, but it does provide indirect clues through patterns of habitation and movement. In wetter regions, sites often show signs of repeated short-term occupation rather than continuous use, suggesting that groups did not remain in a single location for extended periods when conditions limited recovery. This pattern aligns with the idea that the body's response to continuous moisture may have influenced decisions about when to stay and when to move, not through conscious analysis, but through the cumulative effect of reduced comfort and efficiency. From the perspective of human origins, these challenges would have been part of a broader interaction between the body and the environment, where adaptation did not occur in isolation but in response to multiple, overlapping pressures. Early humans evolved with a degree of flexibility that allowed them to function across a range of conditions, but this flexibility does not eliminate cost. In a setting of endless rain, the cost is distributed across many small processes, maintaining warmth, protecting the skin, managing energy, and adjusting behavior to match the environment. None of these changes are immediately visible, and none define survival on their own, but together they shape the limits within which life can continue. The body remains capable, but it operates under a constant, quiet demand that never fully disappears, where stability is maintained not by the absence of challenge, but by the continuous effort to adjust to conditions that do not pause. Moisture does not remain only in the air or on the ground. It settles onto the surface of the body and begins to alter the way the skin functions over time. And in a setting where rain is continuous, this contact is not brief, but prolonged, creating conditions where the outer layer of the body is rarely allowed to return to its usual state. Human skin serves as a barrier, regulating exchange between the body and the environment, but it depends on cycles of drying and renewal to maintain its structure. When the surface remains damp for extended periods, this balance shifts. The outer layers absorb moisture, becoming softer and more permeable, and while this may not be immediately harmful, it reduces the skin's ability to protect against friction, small injuries, and environmental irritants. In a landscape where movement already requires greater effort due to unstable ground, this increased sensitivity can influence how the body responds to repeated contact with surfaces, whether through walking, sitting, or resting on damp terrain. Over time, the accumulation of small stresses on the skin becomes more significant, not as a single injury, but as a gradual weakening of resilience that requires additional energy for maintenance and repair. In modern observations, prolonged exposure to wet conditions is known to affect the outer layers of the skin, making them more vulnerable to mechanical stress and reducing their capacity to act as an effective barrier. Though direct comparisons to early human conditions must be approached with caution, what can be said with greater confidence is that the human body relies on intact skin to manage temperature, prevent fluid loss, and reduce the impact of environmental exposure. And when this system is continuously challenged, other systems must compensate. This compensation is not limitless. It draws on energy reserves that are also needed for movement, for maintaining warmth, and for basic metabolic processes. As a result, the condition of the skin becomes part of a broader pattern of energy allocation, where maintaining the boundary between the body and the environment requires ongoing effort. From the perspective of early human life, there is no direct record of how skin was affected in different climates, but indirect evidence suggests that behavior adjusted to manage exposure. The selection of resting places, the use of natural coverings such as vegetation or animal materials, and the preference for locations with even slight airflow or drainage all indicate attempts to reduce continuous contact with moisture. These actions do not eliminate dampness, but they modify its intensity, creating small variations that can influence how the body responds over time. In regions where rainfall was frequent, such adjustments would have been repeated across generations, not as deliberate strategies in a modern sense, but as patterns that persisted because they reduced the cumulative cost of exposure. From an evolutionary perspective, human skin reflects adaptation to a range of environmental conditions, including periods of humidity and moisture, but it is not specialized for permanent saturation. Instead, it functions best within a cycle that includes both exposure and recovery. In a world of endless rain, this cycle becomes incomplete. The recovery phase shortens or disappears, and the body must operate within a narrower margin of stability. This does not prevent survival, but it changes the baseline condition of the body, making it more dependent on small environmental differences and behavioral adjustments. The sensation of dampness, while not preserved in the archaeological record, can be understood as part of this broader interaction, where the boundary between the body and its surroundings becomes less distinct, and where maintaining that boundary requires continuous, often unnoticed effort. Over time, this effort shapes not only how the body functions, but how movement, rest, and interaction with the environment are organized, reinforcing a pattern of life that is closely tied to the presence of moisture and the gradual effects it imposes on the surface of the human body. Recovery is not a separate state from activity. It is a continuation of the same processes under reduced demand, and in an environment where moisture remains constant, that reduction is never complete. The body depends on periods of relative stability to restore what has been used during movement, to return muscles to a lower level of tension, and to re-establish internal balance. But when the surrounding conditions continue to draw heat away and maintain contact with damp surfaces, recovery becomes partial rather than full. Rest still occurs, but it does not return the body to its previous condition. Instead, it slows the rate of decline, creating a cycle where each period of activity begins from a slightly lower baseline than the one before. This shift is not immediately noticeable, because the body is capable of functioning within a range of states, but over extended periods it changes how much can be done before fatigue limits further effort. In continuous rain, the ground used for resting remains cool and moist, and even when individuals find slightly elevated or better drained areas, the difference is relative, not absolute. The body may reduce movement, but it cannot fully reduce the exchange of heat with the environment. At the same time, damp air slows evaporation, limiting one of the body's natural ways of regulating temperature. These combined effects mean that rest does not fully stabilize internal conditions. Instead, the body maintains a state of low-level adjustment, where energy is still being used to manage temperature, to support the integrity of the skin, and to sustain basic metabolic functions. From a physiological perspective, this constant demand changes how recovery is distributed across time. Rather than distinct phases of effort and restoration, there is a continuous overlap, where the body never fully leaves one state before entering the other. This overlap reduces efficiency, because systems that depend on clear transitions cannot operate at their optimal level. Muscles may remain slightly engaged, circulation may not fully shift to support repair, and the overall sense of restoration is diminished. Modern studies of human physiology suggest that incomplete recovery can affect endurance, coordination, and the ability to sustain repeated effort. Although direct comparisons to early human environments must be made carefully, What can be observed in the archaeological record is not the internal state of the body, but the external patterns that may reflect it. In regions associated with high and persistent rainfall, evidence often points to repeated short-term occupations rather than long, continuous stays, suggesting that groups may have moved before conditions allowed for full recovery, or that remaining in one place did not significantly improve rest. This pattern does not imply constant movement, but a rhythm shaped by the limitations of the environment, where the benefits of staying and the costs of leaving were closely balanced. From the perspective of human origins, this form of partial recovery fits within a broader pattern of adaptation to variable and often challenging conditions. Early humans did not rely on environments that provided consistent comfort, but on the ability to function within imperfect conditions. In a setting of endless rain, this meant maintaining activity even when recovery was incomplete, adjusting behavior to reduce unnecessary strain, and relying on repetition rather than intensity to sustain survival over time. The absence of full recovery does not prevent life from continuing, but it changes its pace and its limits, creating a pattern where energy is conserved more carefully, where movement is measured, and where rest serves to maintain function rather than restore it completely. Over long periods, this pattern becomes the norm, not because it is optimal, but because it is sufficient within the constraints of the environment. The body adapts not by eliminating the effects of moisture, but by operating within them, maintaining a balance that is always slightly unstable, yet persistent enough to allow life to continue without clear resolution. Fire is often imagined as a stable presence, something that once created could be maintained with enough attention, but in an environment shaped by continuous rain, this stability becomes uncertain, and the relationship between humans and fire changes in subtle but important ways. Combustion depends on dryness, not only in the fuel itself but in the surrounding conditions that allow heat to build and sustain a reaction. When the air is saturated and materials are consistently damp, ignition becomes more difficult, and once a flame appears, keeping it alive requires constant adjustment. This does not mean that fire could not exist in wet environments, but that its presence was less predictable, more dependent on small variations in material and location. Wood that appears usable may contain enough internal moisture to resist burning, and even when it ignites, it may produce more smoke than heat, reducing its effectiveness. In such conditions, the act of creating fire is not a single event, but an ongoing process of managing fuel, airflow, and protection from rain. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans used fire across a wide range of environments, including those with significant rainfall, but the traces of fire in wetter regions are often less consistent, sometimes appearing in ways that suggest repeated attempts rather than continuous maintenance. Hearths may be smaller, less structured, or more transient, indicating that fire was used when conditions allowed, rather than relied upon as a constant resource. This does not imply a lack of knowledge, but a limitation imposed by the environment itself. From a biological perspective, the importance of fire extends beyond warmth. It supports food processing, influences daily rhythms, and provides a point of relative stability in otherwise variable conditions. When fire becomes uncertain, these functions are affected in ways that are not immediately visible but accumulate over time. Without reliable heat, the body must rely more heavily on its own mechanisms to maintain temperature, increasing energy demand. Without consistent access to cooked food, the digestive system must process materials that may require more effort to break down, further contributing to overall energy use. These effects do not occur as sudden changes, but as gradual shifts in how the body allocates its resources. From the perspective of human origins, the use of fire is widely considered a significant development, but its role was never independent of environmental conditions. In regions where rainfall was persistent, the benefits of fire would have been present but less stable, requiring a flexible approach rather than a fixed reliance. Early humans may have selected locations that offered some natural protection, such as areas beneath rock formations or dense vegetation, where fire could be more easily sustained. These choices reflect an interaction between knowledge and environment, where the ability to use fire is shaped by the availability of suitable conditions rather than applied uniformly across all settings. There is no direct record of how individuals experience the uncertainty of maintaining fire in such environments, but the material evidence suggests a pattern of adaptation rather than control, Fire appears when it can be supported and disappears when conditions no longer allow it, creating a rhythm that aligns with the variability of the environment rather than overcoming it. In a world of endless rain, fire is not a constant companion, but a temporary alignment of factors that must be continuously managed. Its presence offers moments of relative stability, but its absence is always possible, and the body must remain capable of functioning in both states. This dual condition shapes how energy is used, how time is organized, and how the environment is understood, reinforcing a pattern of life where even the most important resources are subject to the same uncertainty as the ground beneath each step. Finding material that can burn is not a separate task from maintaining fire, because in an environment where rain is constant, the condition of fuel changes from moment to moment, and what appears usable at first contact may not remain so when placed near a flame. Wood absorbs moisture from both direct rainfall and the surrounding air, and even when the outer surface feels less wet, internal fibers may still hold enough water to resist ignition. This means that early humans could not rely on the simple presence of wood as an indicator of its usefulness. Instead, they would have needed to recognize subtle differences in texture, weight, and sound when handling materials, distinguishing between what might burn with effort and what would not sustain a flame. Such distinctions are not recorded directly, but the repeated use of fire in varied environments suggests an awareness of material properties that goes beyond immediate appearance. In wetter regions, this awareness likely extended to the selection of specific types of plant material that dry more quickly or retain less moisture, such as smaller branches, inner bark, or fibrous substances that can catch a spark more easily than dense wood. These materials do not eliminate the challenges of moisture, but they reduce the threshold required to begin combustion, allowing fire to emerge under less favorable conditions. Once ignition is achieved, the challenge shifts to maintaining the flame long enough for larger, less responsive materials to begin burning. This requires a continuous process of feeding, adjusting, and protecting the fire from further exposure to rain. In open environments, this protection is limited, and even slight changes in weather can alter the behavior of the flame. As a result, the management of fire becomes a dynamic activity rather than a static one, where attention must be sustained and small changes in the environment must be accounted for in real time. Archaeological traces from regions associated with persistent rainfall often show signs of repeated fire use in similar locations, suggesting that certain areas provided more reliable conditions for gathering and maintaining fuel. These locations may have offered partial shelter, better drainage, or access to plant materials that were less affected by moisture. The recurrence of such sites indicates that early humans were not only responding to immediate conditions, but were also recognizing patterns in the landscape that supported more consistent fire use. This recognition does not require formal knowledge as understood today, but it reflects an accumulation of experience where certain places and materials are favored because they reduce the effort required to sustain fire. From a broader perspective, the process of finding and managing fuel in a wet environment illustrates the interaction between human capability and environmental limitation. The ability to create fire is present, but its expression depends on conditions that are not fully controllable. In a setting of endless rain, this means that fire cannot be treated as a guaranteed resource. Instead, it becomes something that must be continually re-established, with each attempt influenced by the immediate state of available materials. This repeated effort carries an energy cost, both in the time spent searching for suitable fuel and in the attention required to maintain the flame once it is lit. Over time, this cost contributes to the overall pattern of energy use, influencing how other activities are prioritized and how long individuals can sustain effort in different tasks. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern aligns with a broader theme of adaptation to environments where resources are present but not easily accessed. Early humans did not lack the capacity to use fire, but they operated within conditions that required flexibility and persistence rather than control. The materials needed to support fire were part of the same environment that imposed limits on their use, and managing this relationship became a continuous process rather than a resolved problem. In such a context, the act of finding fuel is not simply a preparation for fire, but an integral part of how fire exists at all, shaping the rhythm of daily life in ways that remain largely invisible, except through the traces left behind in the archaeological record. When fire cannot be assumed to remain, time itself begins to reorganize around its uncertainty, because many of the small stabilizing functions that fire provides, warmth, light, the processing of food, no longer follow a predictable rhythm. Instead of structuring activity around a stable source of heat and illumination, early humans in persistently wet environments would have needed to adjust their actions to moments when fire was possible and to periods when it was not. This does not create a dramatic shift in a single day, but over time it changes how tasks are grouped, how long they can be sustained, and how the body manages its limited energy. Without reliable fire, the transition between day and night becomes less defined by human control and more by environmental conditions. Light fades without replacement, and darkness extends without interruption, not as an immediate threat, but as a constraint on visibility and movement. Activities that depend on sight or fine coordination must be completed within the available daylight, and when rain persists, even daylight can be reduced by cloud cover and moisture in the air. This compression of usable time does not stop activity, but it narrows the range of what can be done efficiently, encouraging a pattern where effort is concentrated into shorter, more cautious intervals. From a biological perspective, the absence of consistent warmth provided by fire increases the body's reliance on its own thermal regulation, which, as previously described, already operates under strain in damp conditions. This additional demand does not create a single point of failure, but it contributes to a cumulative pressure where energy must be allocated carefully across multiple needs, maintaining temperature, supporting movement, and managing the ongoing effects of moisture on the body. When fire is available, even briefly, it offers a temporary easing of these demands, allowing heat to be regained and materials to be partially dried. However, because its presence is not guaranteed, these moments of relief cannot be fully integrated into a stable routine. Instead, they occur irregularly, providing short intervals of reduced effort rather than a continuous baseline of support. Archaeological evidence from wetter regions often reflects this variability in subtle ways. Hearths may appear intermittently within occupation layers, suggesting that fire use was episodic rather than constant. The size and structure of these hearths can also vary, indicating that they were adapted to immediate conditions rather than built for long-term maintenance. This pattern does not suggest a lack of importance for fire, but rather an environment in which its stability could not be assured. As a result, other aspects of life would have adapted to this uncertainty, reducing dependence on fire where possible and maintaining the capacity to function without it when necessary. From the perspective of human origins, this flexible relationship with fire aligns with a broader pattern of adaptation to environments that do not allow full control over resources. Early humans did not always have the option to impose consistent structures on their surroundings, and instead developed ways of living that could accommodate fluctuation. In a setting of endless rain, this meant that the benefits of fire were integrated into life when available, but not assumed as a constant foundation. The rhythm of activity, rest, and movement remained responsive to the environment rather than fixed by a single technological advantage. Over extended periods, this creates a way of living where stability is not built upon permanent resources, but on the ability to adjust to their absence. Fire, in this context, becomes one element among many, important but not dominant, its presence shaping moments rather than defining the entire structure of life. The result is a pattern where time is experienced not as a sequence of controlled intervals, but as a continuous adaptation to conditions that shift without clear boundaries, where each day unfolds within the same uncertainty that governs the ground, the body, and the air itself. Food does not disappear immediately in a world of constant rain, but it changes in ways that are less visible and more difficult to control, and this gradual transformation becomes one of the quiet pressures shaping how early humans interacted with their environment. In dry conditions, many types of food can remain stable for a period of time, allowing for short-term storage or delayed consumption, but when moisture is persistent, this stability becomes less reliable. Organic materials absorb water from the air and from direct contact with damp surfaces, and this added moisture creates conditions where natural processes of breakdown begin more quickly. These processes are not sudden or dramatic, but they alter the texture, smell, and overall quality of food in ways that reduce its usefulness over time. For early humans, this would not have meant that food was always unavailable, but that it was more difficult to keep, more difficult to manage, and more closely tied to the moment in which it was obtained. In such an environment, the concept of holding food for later use becomes limited, not because of a lack of intention, but because the material conditions do not support it consistently. Archaeological evidence from regions with sustained rainfall often shows fewer clear signs of long-term food storage in early periods, suggesting that consumption was more immediate and that resources were used soon after they were acquired. This pattern does not imply a lack of planning, but rather an adaptation to conditions where delaying consumption carried a higher risk of loss. From a biological perspective, this shift affects how energy is distributed across time. When food cannot be stored reliably, the body must depend more heavily on regular acquisition, and periods of abundance cannot be extended as easily into periods of scarcity. This creates a rhythm where the availability of food is more closely aligned with environmental conditions and daily activity, rather than buffered by stored reserves. The digestive system itself is capable of processing a wide range of materials, but the quality of those materials influences how much energy can be extracted and how much effort is required to do so. In damp conditions, where food may begin to change before it is consumed, the body must manage not only the intake of nutrients, but also the additional demands placed on it by altered or less stable resources. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern fits within a broader context of living in environments where predictability is limited. Early humans did not rely on systems of preservation that would develop much later, and instead depended on their ability to locate, process, and consume resources within relatively short timeframes. In wetter regions, this would have meant paying close attention to the state of available food, recognizing when it was still suitable for consumption, and adjusting behavior to minimize loss. These adjustments are not directly recorded, but they can be inferred from the absence of long-term storage features and from the types of sites that are repeatedly occupied. Locations that provide access to fresh resources, such as areas near water sources or regions with consistent plant growth, appear more frequently, suggesting that movement was influenced by the need to obtain food that could be used without delay. The presence of continuous moisture also affects the tools and surfaces used in food processing. Materials that come into contact with damp environments may change more quickly, requiring more frequent replacement or maintenance, and this adds another layer of effort to the process of preparing food. None of these factors alone define survival, but together they create a condition where food is not simply a matter of finding and consuming, but of managing a resource that is constantly shifting under the influence of moisture. In a world of endless rain, the challenge is not only to obtain food, but to use it before it changes beyond usefulness, creating a pattern of life where timing becomes as important as access and where the stability of nourishment is always uncertain, shaped by the same persistent presence of water that defines every other aspect of the environment. Recognizing when food remains usable becomes more complex when moisture is constant, because the changes that occur are often gradual and not always immediately visible. In drier conditions, the difference between fresh and unusable materials can be clearer, marked by distinct shifts in texture or smell, but in a damp environment, these boundaries blur. Surfaces remain soft, scents disperse more slowly in saturated air, and the early stages of breakdown may not present strong signals. For early humans, this would have meant relying on a combination of sensory cues that are subtle rather than obvious, adjusting to variations that do not follow a fixed pattern. This process does not require precise knowledge as it is understood today, but it does depend on repeated experience, where small differences are noticed over time and linked to outcomes that affect the body's ability to extract energy from what is consumed. The act of selecting food, therefore, becomes more than a simple choice between available items. It becomes a continuous evaluation shaped by the condition of the environment, where the same type of resource may vary in usefulness depending on how long it has been exposed to moisture. In such conditions, the timing of collection and consumption becomes closely connected, reducing the gap between finding food and using it. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it limits the extent to which food can change before it is processed. Processing itself may also adapt to these conditions. Cutting, breaking, or otherwise altering food can expose inner portions that are less affected by surface moisture, allowing for more efficient use of available resources. These actions do not fully prevent change, but they shift the balance slightly in favor of immediate consumption, making it possible to access usable material even when the outer layers have begun to degrade. Archaeological interpretations of tool use in wetter regions often suggest repeated, simple processing rather than complex preparation or long-term modification, which may reflect this emphasis on immediacy. Tools that are effective for quick access to edible portions appear frequently, indicating a pattern where the goal is to use resources efficiently within a limited window of stability. From a biological perspective, the body's response to food that has begun to change is not uniform, and while it can tolerate a range of variation, there are limits beyond which the cost of processing such materials increases. This cost is not only in the digestive effort required, but also in the potential reduction of usable energy. When food is less stable, the body may extract fewer nutrients or require more energy to do so, affecting the overall balance between intake and expenditure. In an environment where energy is already being used to maintain temperature and manage continuous exposure to moisture, even small reductions in efficiency can have cumulative effects. From the perspective of human origins, these conditions would have reinforced a pattern of close interaction with the immediate environment, where observation and adjustment played a central role in daily activity. Early humans did not have the ability to preserve food in a way that would stabilize it across extended periods, and so they relied on a combination of mobility, timing, and processing to manage the variability introduced by moisture. This does not imply constant scarcity, but rather a different relationship with resources, where availability is linked more directly to the present moment. The traces of this relationship remain indirect, visible in the types of sites occupied, and in the absence of features associated with long-term storage. These patterns suggest a way of living where the boundaries between finding, preparing, and consuming food are compressed, shaped by an environment that does not allow materials to remain unchanged for long. In a world of endless rain, the challenge is not only to identify what can be eaten, but to do so within a narrow window where the condition of food aligns with the body's ability to use it effectively, creating a rhythm of activity that is closely tied to subtle changes in the environment rather than to fixed routines or expectations. When food cannot be kept stable, the effect does not remain limited to the moment of eating. It extends into how energy is carried through the body over time, shaping patterns that are not immediately visible but become consistent across days and seasons. In a setting where moisture alters food quickly, the amount of usable energy obtained from each meal becomes less predictable, and this uncertainty influences how the body manages its internal reserves. The human body is capable of adjusting to variation in intake, but it does so by shifting how energy is stored and released, relying on short-term availability rather than long-term accumulation when conditions do not support storage. In an environment of persistent rain, where food may need to be consumed soon after it is obtained, the opportunity to build and maintain reserves is reduced. This does not eliminate the body's capacity to store energy, but it limits the consistency with which those stores can be replenished. As a result, the body may operate within a narrower range, where the difference between sufficient and insufficient energy becomes more closely tied to daily conditions. This shift does not create immediate failure, but it changes the margin within which activity can occur, making sustained effort more dependent on recent intake rather than accumulated reserves. From a biological perspective, the relationship between energy intake and expenditure is always dynamic. But in stable environments, there are mechanisms that allow temporary imbalances to be smoothed over time. When food availability is unpredictable or when its quality varies due to environmental factors such as moisture, these mechanisms are still present, but they are used more frequently and with less opportunity for recovery. The body may rely more heavily on its ability to adjust metabolic processes, to prioritize essential functions, and to reduce non-essential activity when intake does not meet demand. These adjustments are not conscious decisions, but physiological responses that help maintain function under varying conditions. In a world of endless rain, where the effort required for movement, temperature regulation, and maintaining the integrity of the body is already elevated, even small fluctuations in energy intake can have amplified effects. The difference between a meal that provides slightly more or slightly less usable energy becomes significant when repeated over time, influencing how long activity can be sustained and how quickly fatigue develops. Archaeological evidence does not directly record the internal energy state of individuals, but patterns of habitation and movement can reflect the outcomes of these processes. In wetter regions, the distribution of sites and the apparent frequency of movement suggest a pattern where groups did not remain in one location long enough to rely on stable local resources, but instead moved in response to changing conditions. This movement is not necessarily driven by scarcity alone, but by the combined effect of variable food quality, environmental pressure, and the need to maintain a balance between intake and expenditure. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern aligns with a broader theme of adaptability, where early humans did not depend on constant abundance, but on the ability to function within fluctuating conditions. The body's capacity to manage variation in energy intake would have been an important factor in survival, allowing individuals to continue operating even when resources were not consistently optimal. However, this capacity has limits, and in an environment where multiple factors increase energy demand, while also reducing the stability of food, those limits become more relevant. Over time, this creates a pattern where activity is shaped not only by what is available, but by how effectively that availability can be converted into usable energy. The environment does not remove food entirely, but it alters its role, turning it into a resource that must be aligned carefully with the body's needs in each moment. In such conditions, survival depends less on the presence of food in general, and more on the continuous adjustment between intake and use, where balance is maintained not through accumulation, but through a steady, ongoing response to a resource that is always in the process of change. Rest is often imagined as a separation from the environment, a period where the body withdraws from external demands and returns to a stable state, but in a landscape of continuous rain, that separation becomes difficult to maintain, and the boundary between activity and rest begins to soften. The surface on which the body settles does not offer a clear contrast to the conditions experienced while moving. Ground remains damp, air retains moisture, and even when the body becomes still, it continues to interact with the same elements that shaped its movement. This continuity changes the nature of rest, not by removing it, but by altering its quality. The body may lie down or reduce movement, but it does not fully disengage from the environment, and this partial engagement influences how recovery takes place. In such conditions, the act of finding a place to rest becomes an extension of the same process used to navigate the landscape. Slight variations in elevation, the presence of natural coverings, or the arrangement of vegetation can create differences in how much moisture is retained or how quickly it dissipates. These differences are not large, but they are meaningful when the alternative is a surface that continuously draws heat away from the body. Archaeological evidence from regions with sustained rainfall suggests repeated use of locations that offer even minimal shelter, such as rock overhangs or areas beneath dense plant cover. These sites do not eliminate dampness, but they reduce direct exposure, creating conditions where the body can maintain a slightly higher level of stability during rest. The repeated occupation of such spaces indicates that early humans recognized these small advantages and returned to them when possible. From a biological perspective, rest is closely linked to the body's ability to regulate temperature, repair tissue, and restore energy, and each of these processes depends on a degree of environmental stability. When the surrounding conditions continue to remove heat and maintain contact with moisture, the efficiency of these processes is reduced. The body may remain in a state of low-level activity, maintaining muscle tone to avoid direct contact with colder surfaces or adjusting position more frequently to manage discomfort. These adjustments are not conscious strategies, but responses to ongoing interaction with the environment, and they prevent the body from entering a fully restorative state. Over time, this leads to a pattern where rest provides maintenance rather than recovery, allowing the body to continue functioning but not to return to its previous condition. From the perspective of human origins, this form of rest would have been part of a broader pattern of living in environments that did not offer consistent support for recovery. Early humans did not rely on constructed sleeping surfaces or controlled indoor spaces, and instead depended on the ability to use available features of the landscape to reduce the impact of environmental factors. In wetter periods, this would have meant prioritizing locations that offered even slight improvements in dryness or insulation, and adjusting patterns of movement to remain within reach of such places. These adjustments do not eliminate the effects of moisture, but they create a framework within which the body can continue to function despite incomplete recovery. The traces of this framework appear in the distribution of archaeological sites, where certain locations are used repeatedly while others are passed over, suggesting a pattern of selective rest rather than random stopping. In a world of endless rain, rest is not defined by comfort or complete withdrawal, but by a temporary alignment with conditions that are less demanding than those experienced during movement. The body does not fully escape the environment, but it reduces its interaction with it just enough to continue, creating a rhythm where rest and activity blend into one another, each shaped by the same persistent presence of moisture that defines the landscape as a whole. When the surface beneath the body remains damp, the way the body settles into rest begins to change, not through deliberate design, but through repeated adjustments that reduce discomfort and conserve warmth. The human body, when given a stable and dry surface, tends to distribute its weight in a way that allows muscles to relax more completely. But when the ground draws heat away and retains moisture, this distribution becomes less effective. Contact with the surface is no longer neutral. It becomes a point of exchange, where warmth is gradually lost and where prolonged pressure may increase the sensation of dampness. In response, the body may shift its position more frequently, reducing the duration of contact with any single area. These movements are not large or disruptive, but they prevent the body from remaining still for extended periods, and this limits the depth of rest that can be achieved. Over time, such adjustments form a pattern, where rest is characterized by intermittent stillness rather than sustained immobility. In wetter environments, natural features that slightly elevate the body from the ground can become more significant. Layers of vegetation, fallen branches, or uneven terrain may provide small separations between the body and the saturated soil. These are not constructed sleeping surfaces in the formal sense, but they offer variations in contact that can influence how the body responds during rest. Archaeological evidence does not preserve the exact arrangements used for sleeping, but the presence of repeated occupations in areas with natural ground cover suggests that such features were not incidental. They may have been part of a broader set of environmental cues that guided where individuals chose to pause, reflecting an awareness of how even minor differences in the surface could affect the body over time. From a physiological perspective, posture during rest influences circulation, muscle recovery, and temperature regulation, and when the body cannot maintain a stable position, these processes are affected. Frequent small adjustments may disrupt the continuity of rest, reducing the time spent in deeper states of recovery. This does not eliminate rest entirely, but it alters its structure, creating shorter intervals of relative stillness separated by periods of repositioning. In a dry environment, such interruptions might be occasional, but in continuous dampness, they become more regular, shaping the overall pattern of rest across the night. The body remains capable of functioning under these conditions, but the efficiency of recovery is reduced, and the effects of incomplete rest accumulate gradually. From the perspective of human origins, these patterns would have been part of a broader interaction between the body and the environment, where adaptation occurs through behavior as much as through physical traits. Early humans did not have access to materials or structures that could consistently isolate them from the ground, and instead relied on the variability present in natural settings. In wetter periods, this meant recognizing and using features that provided even minimal separation from moisture, and adjusting posture in ways that reduced direct exposure. These adjustments are not recorded directly, but they are consistent with the broader pattern of selective site use observed in the archaeological record. Over long periods, such behaviors would have contributed to a way of resting that is less defined by fixed positions and more by continuous adaptation, where the body seeks balance within conditions that do not allow for complete stability. In a world of endless rain, posture is not simply a matter of comfort, but a response to an environment that remains active even when the body becomes still, requiring ongoing adjustment to maintain a level of function that allows movement to begin again when rest ends. When rest is interrupted in small, repeated ways, the structure of sleep itself begins to change, not by disappearing, but by becoming more fragmented, less continuous, and more closely tied to immediate environmental conditions. In stable settings, the body tends to move through cycles of lighter and deeper rest, each phase contributing to recovery in different ways. But when the surface remains damp, when temperature fluctuates subtly, and when posture must be adjusted frequently, these cycles may not unfold as smoothly. The body still enters states of reduced awareness, but the duration of deeper rest may shorten, replaced by more frequent transitions back toward lighter states where adjustment is possible. These transitions are not always conscious, and they do not necessarily wake the individual fully, but they interrupt the continuity that supports more complete recovery. Over time, this pattern creates a form of sleep that is sufficient for maintaining basic function, yet less effective in restoring energy and supporting sustained activity. In environments of persistent rain, the conditions that influence this pattern are continuous rather than occasional. Moisture remains present in the air and on the ground, reducing the difference between one moment of rest and the next. Temperature does not stabilize easily, and the body must continue to regulate its internal balance even while at rest. These demands do not prevent sleep, but they shape its depth and duration, creating a rhythm where rest is distributed across shorter intervals rather than concentrated into longer, uninterrupted periods. Archaeological evidence does not preserve sleep directly, but patterns of occupation and site use may reflect the outcomes of such conditions. In regions associated with sustained rainfall, sites often show signs of repeated short-term use, suggesting that groups did not remain in a single location for extended periods, possibly because the environment did not support continuous effective rest. Movement between locations may have provided opportunities to find slightly better conditions, even if only temporarily, allowing the body to recover more effectively in brief intervals before conditions changed again. From a biological perspective, fragmented sleep affects how the body manages energy, coordinates movement, and maintains internal stability, although the extent of these effects depends on many factors and cannot be precisely reconstructed for early human populations. What can be inferred is that when rest is consistently interrupted, the body adapts by operating within a narrower margin of efficiency, prioritizing essential functions and reducing the capacity for extended effort. This adaptation does not eliminate the need for sleep, but it changes how sleep is distributed and how its benefits are realized. From the perspective of human origins, this form of sleep would have been part of a broader pattern of living in environments where conditions did not allow for complete control over rest and recovery. Early humans did not create fully enclosed or insulated spaces, and instead depended on the variability of the landscape to find moments of reduced exposure. In wetter periods, this variability may have been limited, leading to a pattern where sleep was shaped more by necessity than by optimal conditions. Over long periods, such patterns become integrated into the overall rhythm of life, where activity and rest are not clearly separated but overlap in ways that reflect the continuous influence of the environment. In a world of endless rain, sleep is not a complete withdrawal from external conditions, but a state that remains connected to them, where the body rests while still responding, and where recovery is achieved not through uninterrupted stillness, but through a series of partial pauses that, together, allow life to continue within the limits imposed by constant moisture. Movement, which in stable conditions can extend across distance with a steady rhythm, begins to lose that continuity when rain persists and the landscape remains saturated, because each step no longer transfers energy efficiently from the body into forward motion. The ground absorbs part of that energy, returning less stability with each contact, and this changes not only how far a person can travel, but how movement is organized from one moment to the next. What might have been a smooth sequence of steps becomes a series of careful placements, each one adjusted in response to subtle variations in the surface. The difference is not dramatic at any single point, but it accumulates across time, turning distance into a more demanding task. In such conditions, the body must continuously adapt to a surface that shifts slightly under pressure, requiring constant correction to maintain balance. These corrections involve small muscles that, in drier environments, would be less engaged during routine walking. Over extended periods, this additional effort increases overall energy expenditure, even if the visible pace of movement remains slow. The result is a form of travel where progress is measured not only in distance, but in the energy required to sustain it, and where the cost of movement may limit how far individuals can go before needing to stop. In regions characterized by sustained rainfall, archaeological interpretations often suggest patterns of movement that favor shorter distances and repeated use of familiar routes. These routes may follow natural features such as ridges, slightly elevated ground, or areas with better drainage, where the surface provides marginally more stability. The selection of such paths reflects an interaction with the environment that prioritizes efficiency under constraint, not through the creation of fixed pathways, but through the repeated use of terrain that reduces the effort required for movement. From a biological perspective, the human body is capable of adapting to varied terrain, but it does so most efficiently when the conditions allow for predictable patterns of force and balance. When the ground remains unstable, these patterns are disrupted, and the body must rely more heavily on reactive adjustments rather than on consistent motion. This shift does not prevent movement, but it changes its character, making it slower, more deliberate, and more dependent on immediate sensory feedback. Over time, this can influence how tasks are approached, encouraging strategies that reduce unnecessary travel or that concentrate activity within smaller areas. From the perspective of human origins, such adjustments would have been part of a broader pattern of living within environments that did not support uniform movement. Early humans did not have access to constructed surfaces that could standardize terrain, and instead relied on their ability to navigate variability. In wetter periods, this variability would have been amplified, as water altered the physical properties of the ground across large areas. Movement, therefore, would have been shaped by both the need to reach resources and the limitations imposed by the environment, creating a balance between necessity and efficiency. This balance is not recorded directly, but it can be inferred from the distribution of archaeological sites and the apparent reuse of certain locations over others. These patterns suggest that movement was not random, but guided by an understanding, developed over time, of how the landscape behaved under persistent rain. In a world of endless rain, moving from one place to another is not simply a matter of direction, but a continuous negotiation with a surface that does not fully support the body, where each step must be adjusted, each path reconsidered, and where distance becomes a measure not only of space, but of the effort required to cross it. When movement becomes slower and more demanding, the way food is found and acquired begins to shift as well, because the effort required to reach a resource is no longer separate from the effort required to obtain it. In environments shaped by continuous rain, the landscape does not simply make travel more difficult, it also alters how other living beings move within it, including the animals and plants that form part of the human food system. Surfaces that remain soft can retain tracks more clearly for a short time, but persistent moisture and ongoing rainfall also blur or erase these traces, reducing the reliability of following them over distance. For early humans, this would have meant that tracking, when used, depended on conditions that could change quickly, requiring attention to subtle details that might not persist long enough to support extended pursuit. This does not eliminate the possibility of tracking, but it limits its duration and consistency, shaping how and when it can be used effectively. At the same time, animals moving through damp environments are subject to similar constraints as humans, with their own patterns of movement influenced by ground stability, vegetation density, and the availability of shelter. These patterns may concentrate activity in certain areas, such as slightly elevated terrain or regions with better drainage, creating points where encounters are more likely. Early humans, through repeated observation, may have recognized these patterns, adjusting their movement to align with the behavior of other species, rather than relying solely on direct pursuit. Such alignment does not require a fixed strategy, but emerges from the interaction between environmental conditions and the need to conserve energy in a setting where each movement carries a higher cost. Plant resources are also affected by persistent moisture, not only in their growth but in their accessibility. Dense vegetation can make movement through certain areas more difficult, while the presence of water may influence where particular species are found. Gathering plant materials in such conditions may involve navigating through layers of growth that resist passage, increasing the effort required to reach and collect resources. This added effort must be balanced against the nutritional value of what is obtained, reinforcing a pattern where the cost of acquisition is closely evaluated in relation to its benefit. From a biological perspective, the body's capacity to sustain activity depends on maintaining a balance between energy intake and expenditure, and when the environment increases the cost of movement, this balance becomes more sensitive to variation. The difference between a successful and an unsuccessful attempt to acquire food is not only measured in immediate outcome, but in the energy invested in the process. Over time, repeated patterns of success or failure shape how individuals approach the task, encouraging behaviors that reduce unnecessary effort and increase the likelihood of obtaining resources within a limited range of movement. Archaeological evidence does not record the details of these interactions directly, but the distribution of sites and the types of remains found within them can reflect broader patterns of subsistence. In wetter regions, evidence may suggest a reliance on resources that are more immediately available within a given area, rather than those that require extended travel to obtain. This does not indicate a lack of diversity in diet, but a response to conditions where the cost of reaching distant resources is higher. From the perspective of human origins, this adjustment reflects a general capacity to align behavior with environmental constraints, where the methods used to find and acquire food are shaped by the same factors that influence movement and rest. In a world of endless rain, the process of obtaining food is not defined by a single method, but by a continuous adaptation to conditions that affect both the human body and the surrounding ecosystem. Each attempt to gather or hunt becomes part of a larger pattern, where success depends not only on skill or opportunity, but on the ability to navigate a landscape that changes the cost and reliability of every action, requiring a balance between persistence and conservation that is maintained across time rather than resolved in a single effort. As movement becomes more costly and less predictable, the distance that can be covered within a given period begins to narrow, not as a fixed boundary, but as a gradual limit shaped by the balance between effort and return. In an environment where the ground absorbs energy and where each step requires continuous adjustment, the idea of moving far from a familiar area carries a different weight. The body must account not only for the outward journey, but for the energy required to return, and this calculation becomes more sensitive when conditions do not allow for efficient travel. Over time, this leads to a pattern where movement is organized within a more contained range, centered around locations that provide access to resources while minimizing the need for extended travel across unstable terrain. This range is not static, and it may shift with changes in the environment, but it reflects a tendency to operate within limits that the body can sustain under continuous demand. Archaeological patterns in regions associated with persistent rainfall often suggest repeated use of particular areas rather than wide, uniform distribution of sites. This clustering does not indicate a lack of mobility, but a form of movement that is structured around reliability rather than distance. Locations that offer a combination of accessible resources, slightly better drainage, and some degree of shelter become focal points, and movement occurs between these points rather than across open, less predictable terrain. Such patterns imply an understanding, developed through experience, of where effort yields more consistent outcomes and where the cost of movement may exceed its benefit. From a biological perspective, limiting the range of movement helps conserve energy, but it also creates new challenges. Resources within a smaller area may become less available over time, requiring either more intensive use of what remains or eventual movement to new locations. In a wet environment, where food stability is already reduced and where rest is less effective, the timing of such movement becomes critical. Moving too soon may expend energy without sufficient return, while waiting too long may reduce the availability of resources within the current range. This balance does not produce a single optimal solution, but rather a continuous adjustment, where decisions are shaped by immediate conditions and by the cumulative effects of previous activity. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reflects a broader capacity to adapt movement to environmental constraints, where the scale of activity is not fixed, but responsive to the conditions of the landscape. Early humans did not operate within clearly defined territories in the way later societies might, but within flexible ranges that expanded or contracted, depending on resource availability and environmental stability. In periods of extended rainfall, these ranges may have contracted, not as a permanent state, but as a response to increased costs of movement and reduced efficiency of travel. Over longer periods, as conditions shifted, these ranges could expand again, reflecting the dynamic nature of the environment and the human response to it. The traces of such patterns are indirect, visible in the density and distribution of archaeological sites and in the apparent repetition of occupation within certain areas. These traces suggest a form of mobility that is neither fixed nor random, but structured by the interaction between the body and the environment, where distance is not only a measure of space, but of the energy required to move through it. In a world of endless rain, the boundaries of movement are not marked by physical barriers, but by the limits of sustained effort, creating a landscape that is navigated not in straight lines or broad sweeps, but in measured paths that reflect the continuous negotiation between what is possible and what can be maintained over time. In environments shaped by continuous rain, the traces left behind by human activity do not remain in the same way as they do in drier conditions, because water does not only affect the present moment, it also reshapes what can be preserved over time. Materials that might endure in stable, dry soil often break down more quickly when exposed to constant moisture, and this alters the kind of evidence that remains available. Organic materials such as plant fibers or untreated wood are especially vulnerable, and their absence in the archaeological record does not necessarily indicate that they were not used, but that they did not persist long enough to be recovered. What remains, therefore, is often incomplete, shaped not only by human activity, but by the conditions that determine what can survive. In wetter regions, soil itself becomes an active factor in preservation. Layers of sediment formed under repeated rainfall may shift, mix, or erode, redistributing objects and obscuring their original context. This does not erase all evidence, but it complicates the interpretation of what is found, requiring careful attention to patterns that emerge across multiple sites rather than relying on single, isolated discoveries. For early humans living in such environments, this means that much of their daily activity leaves only faint traces, not because it was insignificant, but because the environment does not preserve it clearly. Archaeological findings from areas known for sustained rainfall often include stone tools, as these are more resistant to moisture and time, but even these objects may be found in positions that reflect movement within the soil rather than their original placement. This movement can occur gradually, as water flows through the ground, carrying fine particles and shifting the position of heavier materials. As a result, understanding how tools were used or where activities took place requires looking at broader distributions rather than precise locations. Patterns of repeated presence, such as clusters of artifacts or consistent associations with certain types of terrain, become more informative than individual finds. From the perspective of human origins, this form of evidence aligns with a way of living that was itself dynamic and responsive to the environment. Early humans did not create permanent structures in many of these settings, and their use of space was often temporary, leaving behind traces that were already limited before environmental processes began to alter them. In wetter conditions, this temporary nature is reinforced, as materials degrade more quickly and as the landscape itself changes over time. Campsites may be reused, but each occupation adds only a thin layer of evidence, and subsequent rainfall can disperse or transform these layers, blending them into the surrounding soil. Despite these challenges, certain patterns can still be observed. Sites located on slightly elevated ground or near natural drainage features appear more frequently, suggesting that these locations were favored for their relative stability. The recurrence of such sites across different periods indicates a consistent response to environmental conditions, even if the details of each occupation are not preserved. From a biological and behavioral perspective, this suggests that early humans were sensitive to the physical properties of the landscape, adjusting their use of space in ways that reduced exposure to continuous moisture. The absence of well-preserved structures or organic materials does not contradict this, but reflects the limitations imposed by the environment on what can endure. In a world of endless rain, the past is not recorded in clear, stable layers, but in patterns that must be inferred from what remains after water has reshaped the evidence. The landscape itself becomes part of the record, not only as the setting in which human life unfolded, but as an active force that determines how that life can be understood, leaving behind a history that is quieter, more fragmented, and dependent on careful interpretation to reveal the ways in which people adapted to conditions that did not preserve their presence easily. What remains in wet landscapes is rarely a complete picture, but certain kinds of traces persist often enough to allow careful inference, and these traces tend to be those that are less affected by moisture, or those that become stabilized through the very processes that alter other materials. Stone tools, for example, appear frequently because they resist decay, and their repeated presence across similar types of terrain suggests patterns of activity that are not random. When clusters of such tools are found on slightly elevated ground or near features that promote drainage, they indicate that early humans returned to these places, not necessarily because they were dry, but because they were more stable than the surrounding areas. The distribution of these artifacts across a landscape can reveal pathways of movement zones of repeated use, and areas that were avoided, even when the finer details of daily life are not preserved. Soil itself, shaped by water over time, can also retain indirect evidence of human presence. Layers that show signs of disturbance, compaction, or mixing may point to repeated activity where the ground was used often enough to alter its structure. In wetter regions, such changes can be subtle, as continuous rainfall may blur or redistribute the evidence, but when similar patterns appear across multiple locations, they suggest consistent interaction between people and the environment. These patterns do not provide direct descriptions of behavior, but they offer a framework within which activity can be understood, linking physical traces to broader processes of movement and use. In some cases, the presence of fire can be inferred even when clear hearth structures are not preserved, through small concentrations of burned material or changes in soil composition. In wet conditions, such traces may be dispersed or reduced, but their recurrence in certain types of locations indicates that fire was used when conditions allowed, and that these locations offered some advantage for sustaining it. This aligns with the broader pattern of selective site use, where environmental features that reduce the impact of moisture are favored, even if they do not eliminate it. From the perspective of human origins, interpreting these traces requires an understanding that absence of evidence does not equal absence of activity. The environment filters what is preserved, and in doing so, it emphasizes certain aspects of life while obscuring others. Early humans likely used a wide range of materials and engaged in activities that leave little or no trace in wet conditions, and the archaeological record reflects only a portion of this complexity. By focusing on patterns that repeat across different sites and regions, it becomes possible to identify common responses to environmental constraints, even when the details vary. From a biological and behavioral standpoint, these patterns suggest a close alignment between human activity and the physical properties of the landscape. The repeated use of certain areas, the apparent limitation of movement ranges, and the selection of locations that offer even slight improvements in stability all point to a way of living that is shaped continuously by the presence of moisture. This does not imply a single strategy, but a set of adjustments that emerge through experience, where small advantages are recognized and reused over time. The consistency of these adjustments across different contexts supports the idea that early humans were not passively affected by their environment, but actively engaged with it, within the limits it imposed. In a world of endless rain, the evidence that remains is partial and often subtle, but it carries within it the imprint of repeated decisions, each one shaped by the need to manage a landscape that does not preserve those decisions clearly. Through careful interpretation of these traces, it becomes possible to approach an understanding of how life unfolded under such conditions, not through direct description, but through the patterns that persist despite the continuous influence of water on both the environment and the record it leaves behind. Even when patterns can be identified across wet landscapes, there remains a boundary to what can be known, because the processes that preserve certain traces also remove or transform others, creating a record that is shaped as much by loss as by survival. In environments of continuous rain, this limitation becomes more pronounced as moisture accelerates the breakdown of organic materials and alters the structure of the ground in ways that obscure fine details. The absence of certain types of evidence, such as plant-based materials, untreated wood, or the precise arrangement of temporary shelters, does not indicate that these elements were unimportant, but that they did not endure under the conditions that followed. This creates a gap between the lived experience of early humans and the physical record that remains, a gap that must be approached with careful interpretation rather than direct assumption. Archaeology in such contexts relies on indirect connections, where one form of evidence is used to suggest the presence of another. The location of stone tools may imply areas of repeated activity, but it does not reveal the full range of behaviors that took place there. Soil disturbances may indicate occupation, but they do not describe how long individuals stayed or how they organized their time. Even traces of fire, when present, may reflect only brief moments within longer periods where fire could not be maintained. These limitations do not render the evidence unreliable, but they require that conclusions remain open, grounded in patterns rather than in specific reconstructions of events. From the perspective of human origins, this incomplete record aligns with the nature of early human life, which itself was not structured around permanent features that could be easily preserved. Movement, temporary occupation, and the use of materials that do not endure all contribute to a record that is inherently partial, even before environmental factors are considered. In wetter regions, this partiality is intensified, as the environment continues to reshape the evidence long after the original activity has ceased. Over time, layers of soil may mix, objects may shift position, and subtle traces may disappear entirely, leaving behind only those elements that are resistant enough to persist. From a biological and behavioral standpoint, this means that much of what can be inferred about early human life in such environments must be understood as a range of possibilities rather than as fixed descriptions. The patterns that emerge from the available evidence suggest certain tendencies, such as the selection of more stable ground or the repetition of occupation in specific locations, but they do not define every aspect of daily life. This uncertainty is not a weakness of the record, but a reflection of the conditions under which it formed. It encourages an approach that considers multiple lines of evidence and remains attentive to the ways in which the environment shapes both what is seen and what is not. In a world of endless rain, the past is not hidden entirely, but it is filtered through processes that favor durability over detail, leaving behind a history that must be assembled from fragments rather than observed directly. This requires a form of understanding that accepts limits, recognizing that the absence of certain evidence is itself part of the story, pointing to the materials and activities that once existed but did not survive. By acknowledging these limits, it becomes possible to approach the archaeological record with a sense of proportion, using what remains to outline the conditions of life without extending those outlines into definitive conclusions. The result is a picture that is quieter and less complete, but still grounded in the consistent patterns that emerge across time, offering a way to understand how humans lived in environments that do not easily preserve their presence, where knowledge is built not from certainty, but from careful attention to what endures despite the continuous influence of water. When the environment applies continuous pressure through moisture, the way individuals exist together begins to reflect not only shared needs, but shared limits, because no single person can fully manage the demands of such conditions alone. In a landscape where movement requires more energy, where rest does not fully restore the body, and where resources change quickly, the structure of small human groups becomes closely tied to the distribution of effort across its members. This does not require formal organization in the way it is understood in later societies, but it creates patterns where tasks are balanced in relation to the constraints imposed by the environment. Some individuals may move to gather resources while others remain in locations that offer slightly better conditions for rest or for maintaining fire when possible, and these roles may shift depending on immediate needs rather than fixed assignments. The group functions not as a rigid system, but as a flexible arrangement where the effort of each member contributes to maintaining the overall balance between energy intake and expenditure. Archaeological evidence does not directly describe how these groups were organized, but patterns of site use suggest repeated occupation by small numbers of individuals consistent with groups that move together but adjust their activities according to local conditions. In wetter regions, the absence of large, permanent structures indicates that such groups did not remain in one place long enough to establish fixed settlements, and instead relied on mobility combined with selective use of locations that provided relative advantages. This mobility is not constant wandering, but a form of movement that is coordinated within the group, where decisions about when to stay and when to move reflect the combined experience of individuals responding to the same environmental pressures. From a biological perspective, living in a group offers advantages that become more significant in challenging conditions. Shared effort can reduce the burden on any single individual, whether in gathering food, maintaining fire, or monitoring the surrounding environment. In a setting of endless rain, where each of these tasks carries an increased cost, distributing them across multiple people allows the group to function more efficiently than individuals acting alone. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it moderates its effects, creating a system where the limitations of the environment are met with a collective response rather than an isolated one. From the perspective of human origins, such patterns align with broader evidence that early humans lived in small, cooperative groups, where survival depended not only on individual capability, but on the ability to coordinate actions within a shared context. In wetter periods, this coordination would have been shaped by the need to manage continuous exposure to moisture, influencing how resources were gathered, how rest was organized, and how movement was planned. These influences do not produce a single model of social organization, but they create conditions under which certain forms of cooperation are more effective than others. The repeated use of particular sites, the clustering of activity in areas with slight environmental advantages, and the apparent balance between movement and stability all suggest a form of group life that is closely aligned with the properties of the landscape. In a world of endless rain, the structure of human groups is not defined by fixed rules or permanent arrangements, but by the continuous adjustment to conditions that affect every member. The environment does not determine behavior in a direct or absolute way, but it shapes the range of possible actions, and within that range, groups develop patterns that allow them to persist. These patterns are not always visible in detail, but their presence can be inferred from the consistency with which certain responses appear across different regions and time periods, reflecting a shared adaptation to a common set of challenges imposed by the constant presence of moisture. In conditions that do not remain stable, experience becomes a form of continuity that is carried not by the landscape, but by the people moving through it, and in a world of persistent rain, this continuity depends on how knowledge is retained and shared across generations. Early humans did not leave written records, and much of what guided their actions would have been embedded in repeated behaviors, in the recognition of patterns, and in the gradual transmission of these patterns through observation and participation. When the environment changes the effectiveness of movement, alters the condition of food, and limits the quality of rest, the ability to notice small differences becomes increasingly important. Slight variations in terrain, the condition of materials, or the timing of certain activities may not appear significant in isolation, but when they are linked to outcomes that affect survival, they become part of a shared understanding that guides future decisions. This understanding does not need to be formalized to be effective. It can be expressed through where individuals choose to move, where they choose to stop, and how they interact with the materials available to them. Over time, younger members of the group would be exposed to these patterns, not as instructions, but as part of the environment in which they learn to act. Archaeological evidence does not directly record the transmission of knowledge, but the consistency of certain behaviors across different sites and periods suggests that these patterns were maintained over time. The repeated selection of locations with slightly better drainage, the use of similar types of materials for fire, and the clustering of activity in particular areas all indicate that certain responses to the environment were not isolated events, but part of a broader continuity. This continuity implies that knowledge of how to manage persistent moisture was not rediscovered in each generation, but carried forward in ways that allowed it to remain effective, even as conditions shifted. From a biological perspective, humans possess the capacity for social learning, where behaviors are acquired through observation and imitation rather than through individual trial alone. In challenging environments, this capacity becomes especially important, as it reduces the cost of learning by allowing individuals to adopt strategies that have already been tested. In a setting of endless rain, where mistakes can lead to increased energy loss or reduced access to resources, the ability to rely on shared knowledge can contribute to maintaining stability within the group. This does not eliminate variation, as individuals may still adapt to specific conditions, but it provides a foundation upon which such adaptations can build. From the perspective of human origins, the transmission of knowledge across generations is a key factor in how humans have been able to inhabit a wide range of environments. In wetter periods, this transmission would have included an understanding of how to move across unstable ground, how to recognize materials that can support fire, and how to select locations that offer relative advantages for rest. These elements are not preserved directly, but their effects can be seen in the repeated patterns that appear in the archaeological record. The persistence of these patterns suggests that early humans were not only responding to their environment in the moment, but also maintaining a connection to past experience that informed their actions. In a world of endless rain, where the environment does not provide consistent feedback through stable conditions, this connection becomes a form of continuity that supports survival. End quote. It allows groups to navigate variability not by controlling it, but by recognizing it, adjusting to it, and passing on the means to do so. Over long periods, this process creates a layer of adaptation that is not visible in the physical record, but is reflected in the consistency with which certain solutions appear, indicating that the knowledge required to manage such conditions was not lost, but sustained through the ongoing interaction between generations and the environment they shared. Over longer stretches of time, the effects of continuous rain are not limited to individual experience or even to a single generation, but begin to shape how groups persist, change, and reorganize themselves across shifting conditions, because an environment that never fully stabilizes requires a form of stability that comes from within the group rather than from the landscape. In such settings, the size and composition of groups may adjust in response to the balance between available resources and the energy required to obtain them. Smaller groups can move more easily and require fewer resources at any given moment, but they also have less capacity to distribute effort, while larger groups can share tasks more effectively, but may place greater demand on local resources that are already limited by moisture and instability. This balance does not produce a fixed structure, but a range within which groups may expand or contract over time, depending on conditions that are not entirely predictable. Archaeological patterns, where they can be observed, sometimes suggest fluctuations in site density and distribution, which may reflect changes in how groups occupied certain areas during wetter periods. These changes do not provide a direct account of group size, but they indicate that patterns of occupation were not static, and that the use of space shifted in response to environmental pressures. From a biological perspective, the capacity to adjust group composition is linked to the broader human ability to respond to variation, where social organization is flexible rather than rigid. In an environment of endless rain, this flexibility allows groups to maintain a balance between cooperation and mobility, ensuring that neither the cost of movement nor the demand for resources becomes overwhelming. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it distributes it in ways that can be managed collectively. From the perspective of human origins, such adjustments would have been part of a long-term process where environmental conditions influenced not only immediate behavior, but also the broader patterns through which populations persisted. Over generations, repeated exposure to similar conditions could lead to the reinforcement of certain behaviors and the gradual shaping of group dynamics that are better suited to managing continuous moisture. These changes do not occur suddenly, and they do not result in a single, optimal form, but they create tendencies that can be observed across different regions and time periods. The presence of repeated site use, the clustering of activity in areas with slight environmental advantages, and the apparent balance between movement and stability all suggest that groups were not only responding to immediate conditions, but also adjusting their internal structure to align with those conditions. This alignment does not require conscious planning in the modern sense, but emerges through the cumulative effect of decisions made in response to the environment, where those patterns that support persistence are more likely to continue. In a world of endless rain, where the landscape does not provide a consistent foundation, the continuity of human life depends on the ability of groups to reorganize themselves in relation to changing conditions, maintaining connections across time even as the details of daily life shift. This creates a form of stability that is not tied to place, but to the relationships between individuals and the shared patterns of behavior that allow them to function within an environment that remains in constant motion. Over long periods, this dynamic produces a history that is not defined by fixed settlements or permanent structures, but by the ongoing adjustment of human groups to conditions that require both persistence and flexibility, where survival is maintained not through resistance to change, but through the capacity to adapt to it without losing continuity across generations. Change does not appear as a clear turning point in environments that remain consistently demanding, and in a world shaped by continuous rain, adaptation does not take the form of a single solution, but of many small adjustments that accumulate across long periods of time. These adjustments are not always visible within a single lifetime, because they are distributed across repeated experiences, across the choices made in response to similar conditions, and across the gradual alignment of behavior with what the environment allows. Early humans did not step into such environments and immediately transform how they lived. Instead, they carried with them patterns developed in other contexts, and then modified those patterns in response to the persistent presence of moisture. This modification is not a process of invention in a single moment, but of refinement, where certain actions are repeated because they reduce effort, while others are gradually abandoned because they do not. Over generations, this process creates a form of adaptation that is difficult to isolate because it does not belong to any one individual or event. Archaeological evidence reflects this gradual change through shifts in patterns rather than through abrupt transitions. The repeated use of particular types of terrain, the consistent association of activity with areas that offer slight environmental advantages, and the persistence of certain tool forms across different sites all suggest a continuity of response that evolves slowly. These patterns do not indicate a fixed strategy, but a set of tendencies that become more pronounced as they are reinforced over time. In wetter regions, such tendencies may include a preference for elevated ground, a focus on immediate resource use, and a pattern of movement that balances stability with the need to access new areas. None of these elements alone defines adaptation, but together they create a framework within which life can continue despite the limitations imposed by the environment. From a biological perspective, human adaptation operates on multiple levels, including behavior, physiology, and, over longer timescales, genetic variation. In the context of continuous rain, most of the observable changes are likely to have occurred at the level of behavior, where flexibility allows individuals to adjust without requiring structural changes to the body. This flexibility is a key feature of human evolution, enabling survival across a wide range of conditions by altering how existing capacities are used rather than by developing entirely new ones. The body remains fundamentally the same, but its interaction with the environment shifts, guided by patterns that have proven effective in managing the demands of moisture, instability, and variable resources. From the perspective of human origins, this form of adaptation highlights the importance of time as a factor in shaping how life responds to environmental pressure. Conditions that persist over long periods do not force immediate change, but they influence the direction of gradual adjustments, favoring those responses that maintain balance between energy use and environmental constraint. In a world of endless rain, this means that adaptation is not a movement toward complete control over the environment, but toward a more precise alignment with its properties. Early humans did not eliminate the effects of moisture, but they learned, over many generations, to function within those effects, adjusting movement, rest, resource use, and social organization in ways that reduced their cumulative impact. This process does not produce a final state, because the environment itself continues to change, but it creates a continuity of response that allows life to persist. The evidence of this continuity is subtle, visible in the consistency of patterns rather than in dramatic transformations, and it suggests a form of adaptation that is quiet, incremental, and deeply connected to the long history of human interaction with environments that do not provide stable conditions, where survival is maintained not through sudden innovation, but through the steady accumulation of small, effective changes over time. Not every pressure can be reduced through adjustment, and in a landscape of persistent rain there remain limits that the body and behavior cannot fully overcome, no matter how gradually adaptation unfolds across generations. These limits do not appear as sharp boundaries, but as steady constraints that shape what is possible and what must be avoided, defining the edges of sustainable life rather than its center. Continuous moisture affects multiple systems at once: movement, temperature, food stability, rest, and while each can be managed to a degree, their combined effect creates a condition where improvements in one area do not entirely offset the demands in another. The body can adjust posture to reduce heat loss, but it cannot eliminate it while in contact with damp ground. It can modify patterns of movement to conserve energy, but it cannot restore the efficiency lost to unstable terrain. It can respond to changes in food quality, but it cannot fully compensate for the variability introduced by moisture. These constraints do not stop activity, but they prevent it from reaching the same level of stability that might be possible in drier conditions. Archaeological patterns reflect these limits not through direct evidence of failure, but through the absence of certain developments in regions dominated by persistent rainfall. Long-term continuous occupation of a single site appears less frequently, suggesting that conditions did not support extended stability. The lack of substantial, durable structures in early periods of such environments also indicates that the materials and conditions available did not allow for permanent modification of the landscape at that time. These absences are not signs of incapacity, but of environmental boundaries that shaped what could be sustained. From a biological perspective, the human body operates within ranges that allow for variation but not unlimited flexibility. Systems that regulate temperature, manage energy, and support recovery can adjust to changing conditions, but they do so within limits that are defined by underlying physiology. When these systems are engaged continuously without full recovery, their efficiency decreases and the margin for additional stress narrows. In a setting of endless rain, where multiple demands are present at once, this narrowing becomes more significant, influencing how long activity can be sustained and how often rest is required, even if that rest remains incomplete. From the perspective of human origins, recognizing these limits is part of understanding adaptation as a process that works within constraints rather than removing them. Early humans did not transform wet environments into dry ones, and they did not eliminate the effects of continuous moisture. Instead, they operated within the boundaries set by these conditions, adjusting behavior to remain within a range that could be maintained over time. This may have included moving between areas that offered temporary advantages, altering patterns of resource use, or changing the scale of activity to match available energy. These responses do not remove the limits, but they allow life to continue within them. Over long periods, this creates a pattern where certain possibilities remain unrealized, not because they were not imagined, but because they could not be sustained under the prevailing conditions. The environment shapes not only what is done, but also what is not done, leaving gaps in the record that reflect these boundaries. In a world of endless rain, the presence of limits is not a sign of failure, but a defining feature of how life is organized, where adaptation is measured not by the elimination of difficulty, but by the ability to persist within it, maintaining a balance that remains slightly unstable yet sufficient to continue across time without resolution. When the limits of an environment remain present across long periods of time, what begins as a set of constraints gradually becomes part of the structure through which life is understood, not as an obstacle to be removed, but as a condition to be lived within. In a landscape shaped by continuous rain, where the ground does not fully dry, where warmth is not easily retained, and where resources shift in subtle but constant ways, human life does not move toward resolution. It settles into a pattern of ongoing adjustment, where stability is never complete, yet never entirely absent. This pattern does not announce itself as a final state, because it remains open, shaped by the same processes that define it. The body continues to regulate, to compensate, to maintain balance within a range that is narrower than in more stable environments, but still sufficient for life to persist. Movement continues, measured not by distance alone, but by the energy required to sustain it. Rest continues, not as full recovery, but as partial renewal that allows activity to begin again. Food continues to be found and used, not as a stored reserve, but as a resource that must align with the moment in which it is obtained. These continuities do not resolve the challenges imposed by moisture, but they form a rhythm that can be maintained across time. From the perspective of human origins, this rhythm reflects a broader truth about how humans have lived in varied environments. Adaptation does not always lead to control or transformation of the landscape. In many cases, it leads to a closer alignment with the conditions that cannot be changed, where behavior, movement, and social organization are shaped by factors that remain outside of direct influence. In wetter periods of the past, this alignment would have required a sensitivity to small differences, an awareness of how slight changes in terrain, material, or timing could affect the balance between effort and return. These sensitivities are not preserved as explicit knowledge, but their effects appear in the consistency of patterns observed across different regions and timeframes. From a biological perspective, the ability to maintain function within such conditions is part of what defines the human species. The body is not optimized for any single environment, but is capable of operating across a range of conditions through continuous adjustment. This capacity does not remove limits, but it allows life to continue within them, creating a form of resilience that is not based on strength or permanence, but on flexibility and persistence. In a world of endless rain, this resilience is expressed in the quiet continuation of activity, in the ability to move, rest, and adapt without requiring the environment to become stable. Over long periods, this form of living does not produce a final answer to the question of how to survive such conditions. Instead, it maintains the question itself, as each generation encounters the same patterns and responds in ways that are similar, yet shaped by their own moment within a larger continuity. The absence of a clear resolution is not a gap in understanding, but a reflection of the environment itself, which does not settle into a single unchanging state. It continues to shift, to impose limits, and to allow partial solutions that sustain life without completing it. In this sense, the experience of living in endless rain is not defined by overcoming the environment, but by existing within its ongoing presence, where each action is part of a larger process that does not conclude, and where the meaning of survival lies not in reaching a stable end, but in maintaining the balance that allows life to continue without final certainty. So when we return to the question that guided this reflection, it does not close with a definitive answer, because the conditions it describes do not resolve themselves. Instead, it remains open, shaped by the same uncertainty that defined the lives of those who lived within it. What human life was really like living in endless rain is not a single condition to be described, but a continuous negotiation that does not end, inviting us to consider not how it was solved, but how it was sustained, and whether such a way of living can ever be fully understood from a distance where the ground is dry.